I wanted to do a quick analysis video on the melody of Gone Still, which is a track from 9 Inch Nails' 2002 studio release, Still. That was a mouthful. And just try to look at why this melody is so haunting and so kind of unusual sounding. And I was comparing it a little bit to The Frail, which also has a very haunting melody, very dark sound, and also has sort of minimal instrumentation and sparse harmony. And part of this is because they both share the same scale, Mixolydian flat 6. But unlike The Frail, Gone Still has a special quality to it. It has a little bit more of a curious, sort of uncertain, and almost playful tone on top of the darkness, and that's what I'm really, really interested in discovering today. Mixolydian flat 6 is arguably the most commonly used scale in 9 Inch Nails music. Okay, so what fascinates me though about this song is how it uses this scale. This is pretty harmonious sounding, very satisfying, really things locking into place. Still very mysterious sounding though, because that flat 6 just doesn't sound like it belongs. But what's making this melody sound a little bit strange is not that part, it's the part before it. So the melody is starting with the second degree and then moving up or resolving up to the major third. That's one of our points of stability in the scale. So there's sort of this suspended feeling. It's just like an embellishment in a way of the third. But then the next two notes we hear are the flat 6 and flat 7, the least two notes that we expect. What I'm hearing is basically a series of two tritones. If you don't know what a tritone is already, Adam Neely just came out with an excellent video about it. It's been sort of nicknamed colloquially the devil's interval, but maybe that's all folklore. He goes into that, but it sounds very unstable, extremely dissonant, and very awkward, and it's hard to use in a beautiful way, and yet Trent Reznor does it all the time. So I call it the Trent tone, usually. And both those tritones are in this melody. There is one consecutive tritone created, but the other one is sort of just an impression, especially because he leaves the sustain pedal on his piano, so all the notes sort of mingle together. So you kind of hear this. Just to demonstrate how weird this melody is, try to sing it. How'd you do? It's not easy because of the tritones. Like if I just played this by itself with no bass line and no context, I think most people would think I was playing like avant-garde music that had no tonal center. Another way to think about this melodic run is that it's just an embellishment of an E-flat augmented chord. Sort of like all those other notes are just sort of neighboring tones, kind of, just creating a little bit more movement, but that the ultimate sound that is trying to be communicated is this augmented chord. It really depends on how you hear it. But an augmented chord is a weird chord. And I'll go more into that in just a second. But before we do, I just want to kind of note that there's some really tidy little resolutions at the end of this sort of lost sounding phrase initially. So we have, when we reach that, it feels like a point of rest, doesn't it? And then even more so, kind of just walking us down the scale, stopping at these points of rest. And then the second time, he just ends on the 5th. On the 4th repetition, he wraps it up even nicer for you. That's a G major triad. We don't usually hear triads in Trent Reznor's music. They're very far and few between, and when they happen, they have a lot of power because they're so uncommon. But they also have power in general because you have all the information you need to understand the tonality of the chord and the function of the chord. So he usually doesn't give us all that information, but here he's decided to do that. And it sounds kind of like classical music to me. And there's another part in the song that has the same vibe. And one of my patrons said that this song reminds her of like a broken music box. And I really hear it on that part. It feels like ballet, doesn't it? It's something, little punctuation. It's so straight ahead. It's such a nice contrast to these mingling tritones. So if this weren't already super cool enough, then the bass line leaves the tonic and goes down to the E flat, which would be like a flat 6 chord, my favorite. But what it's implying with the melody is sort of like an E flat augmented chord, which I mentioned before. So augmented chords are very strange. They are completely symmetrical, 2 major thirds stacked on top of each other. And so what this does is it omits the perfect fifth that normally encases a major or minor triad. So instead, it doesn't feel fixed. It feels like it's floating. It feels maybe a little dramatic, feels unhinged, almost like overly bright. Like if any chord had to represent fake happiness, I feel like maybe this chord might do a better job than even the major chord. I guess depending on context. The chords in the Mixolydian flat 6 scale, the chords that are native to the scale, are kind of unusual. There are 2 diminished chords, and then there's an augmented chord. The major and natural minor scales don't have an augmented chord already, so this is sort of an unusual sound for a lot of our ears. But this song has definitely succeeded, I think, in using that augmented chord very nicely. I'm not surprised that Trent Reznor is comfortable with the sound of an augmented chord. That B flat would be what would fit into the E flat major chord, not the B natural. So he leaves the B natural there, and it sounds especially strange, like a broken clock, especially with that bass line on the offbeats. But on the 3rd repetition, after hearing this sort of disjointed sound, he flattens that B flat just one time. And when that happens, every time I'm like, because it's so incredibly beautiful, and everything feels like it changes, like the whole tone changes. The melody meanders downward as the bass line also does, and it sets up sort of this half cadence, which is like a very classical situation. Classical music, I mean. So we end up on this major 5 chord, and sort of the implication is that it would resolve, I think in this case, back to sort of a minor 1. And that's kind of what happens in the second half of the song. The whole setup reminds me of the harmonic minor scale, which a lot of classical music was written in. So if this part ever sounded like classical music to you, there's a reason for that. It always has for me. It's such an interesting juxtaposition, but it really speaks to, I think, his influences. It's interesting to think if he was having sort of an internal battle here of like what he's expected to do versus what he really wants to do. And then the melody's over and we're left with this very kind of gentle but cold section with these big, long pads. And it feels like wise. I feel like this old wisdom about this section. In contrast to the first section, which felt more playful, but still dealing with a dark subject, almost like a child trying to process loss versus an old person, like the wrinkles in their eyes I can feel when I hear those chords. Dang, why isn't this song in a movie? Thank you so much for watching.